fascinating discussion that we're going to have today.
Okay, thank you very much. من البداية أنا بتسوي يعني امتحان معكم صغير صبرك بدي منكم عشان هاي امتحان لما أنا بحكي معكم هذا فرجيكم المثال يعني شلون الظروف مع الناس لما مو يحكوا اللغة لما إحنا بنحكي هون بشكل عام بيننا. أوكي؟ وعندي في هاي محادثة في هاي نقاش أن المميزة إحنا نقدر كلنا نفهم مع بعض ونفهم نفس اللغة مع بعض، بس أكو كتير ناس من البلدان الثانية لما مو عندهم هاي مميزة، مو عندهم هاي إمكانية، وهذا معنى أصواتهم هم مش في النقاش وهم مش في الجدلية. يمكن أنتم قاعدين هون تفكرون أوكي إحنا بتحس شوي مرتبطين، وين المترجم؟ كيف بالفاهمينا؟ شنو القصد هنا؟ إحنا مش مرتاحين في هاي هالشي. ليش هي بتسوي هيك؟ يعني يمكن هي مجنونة أو شيء زي هيك، بس أنا بدي يعني بس فرجيكم مثال وهلا أنا بفهمينكم بالضبط شو أنا تسوي. Okay, so thank you for your patience. That was just a small kind of awareness exercise that I wanted to give around what a privilege we all have to be able to speak the same language, and in the context of the UK is the English language, and it's actually the kind of dominant discourse or language of the discourse that we're involved in, and there are many people who are absolutely excluded from the debate about Europe, and they'll be the hardest hit in the debate about Europe. There are many Polish people, I work for them as a union organizer, who don't speak English, and many Romanians, Hungarians, Bulgarians, new workers in this country who are feeling very scared right now and who don't have a voice. So I really wanted to just sort of show it to you because you're probably feeling like, oh, really weird, what's she doing? Oh, I feel uncomfortable, where's the translation? Well, that's how a lot of people are feeling all the time who are working here and being here in this country. So I just want to introduce two people who really do use their voice and really do use it to support marginalized people. Adrian Zandberg, who's a leading member who stood as a candidate for Razem party in Warsaw during the parliamentary elections. He's very well known, and he's here especially for this. Is it just for this that you came?
Not only for this. I'm sorry to say this. But 50% for this.
Okay, and Owen Jones, who is a columnist, a writer, an activist. Again, two people using their platform, using their voices to support and encourage a real democratization of the debate, which is actually pretty narrow in whose voices are being heard. So, and I'll introduce myself. I'm Ewa Jasiewicz. I'm an activist and I'm a union organizer, and I write sometimes, and I live here in London. So I'll kick off with, I guess, asking you, Owen, but feel free to come in as well. Brexit. It looks like the UK is probably going to leave the EU. Now, is that really such a bad thing?
UK?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, blimey word. I'm going to try and cheer us all up by the end of the night, okay? But we might have to go down before we go up, just so we're all on the same page. I mean, firstly, it's well done for putting us on, well done to Razem and the rest. And the only way, whatever happens, we're going to solve the problems that all of our respective countries face in one country at a time. We've got to build international solidarity across borders. The people we're up against don't know borders. The injustices we face don't know borders. And similarly, we have to have the same approach. And I'm going to Spain on Sunday. I have an election there. And that's part of a movement that is sweeping Europe, in some places stronger than others, to try and change the European Union and build a different sort of Europe running the interests of the majority. In terms of Britain leaving the European Union, at the moment, if I was a betting man, I would say yes, Britain is heading for Brexit. And that, I think, should worry people a lot. And the reasons for that is, I have lots of problems with the European Union. I last year spoke about how the left should consider Brexit, not least if David Cameron negotiated away workers' rights, which are guaranteed as part of our membership of the European Union. And I suppose, and that didn't happen partly because the trade unions and the Labour Party spoke out and said, or senior Labour figures saying they wouldn't unconditionally support any deal that David Cameron came up with, so he refused to come back and negotiate away things like the social chapter. The reason I suppose people should be worried are multiple. Firstly, rights that are guaranteed as part of the membership of the European Union, like the Agency Workers Directive, which this government resisted its implementation, which gives agency workers the same rights as full-time workers, ironically stopping the undercutting of wages of full-time workers. Part-time workers given the same rights as full-time workers, guaranteed paid annual leave, and there's no question at all that the Leave campaigns are a coalition of the Conservative right and the hardcore Conservative right and UKIP. And these are people who are ideologically and zealously opposed to those rights, and their leading figures have written over the years about the desire to scrap these rights, which they describe as red tape. And that will be devastating for working people, of course, in this country. I think in terms of, we could be building the likes of Podemos in Spain. They're desperate for us to stay because they want to link arms and achieve change. Now, there has been movement made on things like tax justice and climate change at the EU level. Not enough, but some, and only because people campaign for it. Similarly, TTIP, which some of you will know, this trade treaty, which gives corporations the same legal rights as countries, the ability to sue them in secret courts for policies they don't like. At the moment, that lies in tatters because of people marching from Warsaw to Madrid, from London to Athens to march against that, and that's why now the French government is amongst those saying that they'll veto it in its current form because of popular pressure. And the likes of Podemos want us to stay with them in order to try and achieve change within the European Union at that level. The other point is just an absolute critical point, and it is the issue of immigration, because this is not principally, and it has become not a debate about the European Union, it's principally about immigration. The whole campaign, the mainstream campaign, not a peripheral tiny campaign supported by a very small minority of the left, because the left is overwhelmingly united in terms of the major trade unions, in terms of the Labour leadership, including the Labour left, Labour Party membership, Momentum, all those major organisations, and from Jeremy Corbyn onwards, they all support staying in the European Union. Yes, there are a tiny group on the left and two or three tiny trade unions supporting it. They have not shaped this campaign at all. And all that will happen if Britain votes to leave is it will be seen above all else as a rejection of immigration. And that's what the polling shows. That the reason above all else people, if they want to leave the European Union, it's because of immigration. That's partly a failure of people like myself on the left, because people in this country increasingly have seen many of the huge problems that scar and define our society through the prism of immigration. The areas with often the least immigrants are often the areas with the most anti-immigration sentiment, like where I grew up, Stockport. No offence to my own town, that people flocking to Stockport is not one of its major problems. People leaving Stockport, myself included, its population has declined. About 3% of its population are immigrants, and yet, because of the failure to come up with a coherent narrative that the problems people face in Stockport, lack of affordable housing, lack of secure jobs, falling wages, public services that have been hit, are to do with a society rigged in favour of a tiny elite, a society that puts the market ahead of the needs and aspirations of the majority. Increasingly, that's been seen through the prism of immigration, including in communities where there aren't any. Clacton, the only constituency in Britain to return a UKIP MP, less than 1 in 20 of its population are foreign-born. In London, UKIP are a peripheral force. It will vote almost certainly decisively to stay within the European Union, and yet this is the absolute centre of immigration. 4 out of 10 people in inner London are foreign-born, and even amongst people who are white, native-born Londoners, they are far less likely, according to all research, to oppose immigration. And the real issue is, if we vote to leave, it will be seen as a vindication of an anti-migrant, anti-immigration campaign. I don't know where it leads people who are A, British living abroad, or EU citizens who are living here in Britain. And it will mean a right-wing Conservative, and even more right-wing Conservative government. Look, I've campaigned and protested against this government every day practically, in terms of in some form or other. But it is a failure of imagination to not realise how much worse this government could get, and it will be terrible. because it will be the most hard-right elements of the Conservative Party coming to power, arguing they have a popular mandate for an anti-migrant campaign, and then they will use that to be able to rip apart rights that people have fought for. Priti Patel, one of the leading Tory campaigners, well, she wants to reintroduce the death penalty, and guess what? Britain would be able to do so, obviously, if it left the EU. I'm not saying she'd get away with doing that, but the reality is we're just talking about people with a very hard right agenda, and the constraints that exist on them at the moment won't be there, and they will exploit that to the full. It will not be a vote, be seen as a vote against austerity or cuts, or privatisation, or for workers' rights. It will be seen as a Tory right which will be triumphalist, feel vindicated, and it will use that triumphalism and vindication to implement those. Now, it's a bit late in terms of I want people to mobilise, I want us to organise. We will have to be prepared, though, for the most bitter fight of our lives if it's Brexit, because from everything from workers' rights to migrant rights to climate change to tax justice, things are hard now. They'll get a lot harder, and we're going to have to mobilise like never before. So my plea, my begging of people here is do something in the next few days. Don't let this happen. There's another Europe is possible. I'm part of that, arguing for more democratic, accountable Europe to change Europe, but we've got to do something in the next few days. I don't think people realise just how dangerous this moment is. It's a very, very dangerous moment at all for anyone who believes in social justice, a more progressive Britain running the interests of the majority. And we're staring over the cliff edge, but we can get people, hopefully, to march back, but it can only be done if all of you do something in the next few days to campaign for that progressive campaign to build a different Europe, not to leave with a Tory Brexit, a Brexit not on the terms of the left, a Brexit on the terms of the hard right. You've got to do something, all of us.
Okay, thank you very much, Owen. Before I pass on to Adrian, I just want to put in my 2 cents as someone who's worked with a lot of migrant workers in this country, and also British-born white workers and workers of colour, who have actually come out with a very pro-Brexit, not migrant workers, but a lot of British workers and trade unionists that I've been meeting have really been wanting this. And the argument that they're using is a very kind of crude lack of solidarity, lack of kind of self-belief in actual power of trade unionism, in part fomented by the fact that the laws in this country are so restrictive to actually render a lot of trade union activism as just sort of muzzled, basically, and people just getting exhausted. But I have heard a very crude argument around supply and demand, and how, if we just get these migrant workers out, then we'll be able to get work. Now, I don't believe that argument, and quite frankly, if it was to happen in the hospitality industry, where I organise 70% migrant worker workforce, as it is, Boris Johnson can't even get out of bed and wipe his own arse without a migrant worker helping him. literally, in a hotel, who's putting and Cameron, who's putting that toilet roll in the toilet paper dispenser in that hotel room? It's a Romanian worker, a Polish worker, a Bulgarian worker. That's who's doing it. But I am hearing these arguments, which actually the agency worker regulations didn't do anything to temper or resolve, because there's a sort of thing called the Swedish derogation, which basically rendered the agency worker regulations almost useless. We're still meeting people who are on agency contracts, for years, 5 years, 6 years, 4 years, literally. And the one thing that can stop you from getting equal treatment with a full-time contract worker is if you have one aspect of your contract that gives you something else that you're doing, so then you're not actually doing the same job. They found their loopholes. Really, they have. But there are other protections, obviously. But, what is the answer to people who are coming out with this kind of stuff? Because actually, 10 years ago, agencies, big companies, were hiring agencies to go into Eastern Europe, and I'm sure that it's happening now with the new accession countries, to bring workers over and work directly in the UK, and actually to the sidelining of workers here. Now, I believe in an international working class. That's my position, and I'm absolutely for Remain, and I don't buy this kind of divisional argument of one working class being better than the other. We're all workers. But what do we do when you've got that kind of situation, particularly in Thanet, where Nigel Farage was standing for MP, and he sees it as his stomping ground? There was a company there called Thanet Earth that promised local jobs and employed only 99% migrant workers in their massive, biggest greenhouse project in the country. I'm not saying that those jobs should not go to those workers, but when people are making this argument that we didn't get a job, there's kind of evidence for that. But the blame is with the bosses, obviously. But I think we should sort of think about that as well, how migrants are being exploited, and that's being used to really, toxify relationships and actually force people into positions of ever more subordinate poverty, pay, and casualisation. And that's happening to everyone. But, Adrian, what do you think?
Okay, it's really hard to comment on Brexit being here for less than 48 hours. One thing that is striking, even for a person that came here less than 48 hours ago, is when you look at the support at the Remain camp and Leave camp, is seeing something really striking, and that is that you see those northern communities that used to be strongholds of labour, that you see people who have low education and who are buying the right-wing camp's argument. And it is something that I think is not a particular case of Britain. In many countries, you see a similar pattern. When you look at Poland, you would see that right-wing arguments, no matter how wrong they are, or no matter how evil they are, won a lot of base among working classes, won a lot of power base among the industrialized communities. And that's the pattern that can be easily understood when you look at the mainstream social democratic parties that are dead inside and actually followed neoliberalism for 20 years and did not have any proposal for those groups other than becoming the manure of history. But when you ask yourself why those people do not really want to buy the narrative of another Europe being possible, I think the major reason why the right is so efficient, so badly efficient in winning over, is no matter how wrong the arguments are, no matter how evil the arguments are, they are practical. Now, when we talk about another Europe, when we talk about democracy, when we talk about transparency, when we talk about getting the power back from the corporation and giving it back to the people on a European scale, it does not translate to everyday experience of a person living in an impoverished community in Poland or in an impoverished industrialized community in Britain. And I think here is the biggest difference between how left functions today and how it used to function like 40 or 50 years ago. Because democratic left was really very good at being at the same time able to have a far-fetched vision and being very practical and step-by-step proposals that it gave. Now the whole strength and ability of traditional socialist parties to make social change was because of that. And what we now say when we talk about another Europe that is possible, well, it's all very okay and true when Varoufakis says that we need more transparency and that we need to record how the ECB proceedings are taking place here, but you will not win the sales of former miners by proposing him that kind of project. Now that must translate into everyday experience. They must see what this another Europe would produce in their lives. Would it be, I know, European universal minimum income? Would it be new forms of European social policy? Would it be a guaranteed minimum wage based on purchase parity? But they would need to get some practical hope and hope translated into practical proposals. And I think that's what lacks in this narratives that defend another Europe. And I'm not very sure, possibly it's not so, and my observation is simply not, my observation is not accurate. Possibly something like it takes place in the Remain campaign, but if it does, it doesn't show up in in the media that a visitor from Poland might see after today's. So I think as a symptom of something much wider than just British fight against far right, against far age, against all those vested interests that support now the Leave campaign, and without reviving that sense of practicality and ability to talk about social Europe not as a highly hypothetical project, but something that consists of very practical pillars, we would be losing Brexit after Brexit and country after country. And I said, as a representative of a country where really a lot of what could be lost was lost already.
Absolutely. So I think maybe there's a common theme, correct me if I'm wrong, of dispossession. I think a big fueling argument for the right wing gaining ground in Poland, in this country, is this sense of loss. That, you know, we've lost our social housing, we've lost jobs, we're losing the National Health Service, we've lost control, and we need to take our country back. I mean, it's a very seductive prospect. I mean, anarchists say it all the time, you know, reclaim the power, reclaim our, you know, rights, reclaim, I might not say reclaim our country because we're no borders, but this real surge towards getting back what has been taken away from us by 30 years of neoliberalism in this country, radical shock therapy in Poland since the 90s. And so how do we respond to that in a practical, okay, this is what we can have way? Because I think I agree with Adrian, there hasn't been much of a kind of Remain argument for like, this is our charter, like we had in the Scottish referendum, where it was very clear what was being sought after, you know, what we are for. It's more a kind of, shit, we can't let the far right win, but then what's the programme? Easy.
Yeah. on that point about, I mean, look, discontent is sweeping the Western world, and this is just one manifestation of it, and it's going in one of two different directions. It's going in a kind of these new movements of the left, and on the other hand, the populist xenophobic right. So in the United States, you have the rise of Bernie Sanders on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got that quasi-fascist clown Donald Trump. And you've got, you know, in same here in Britain, on the one hand, you think about Scotland, but that's it, the independence movement. You've got the Greens, you've got the Corbyn phenomenon in the Labour Party. On the other hand, you've got UKIP. Again, you know, in Spain, Podemos, an anti-austerity new party of the left. In France, it's the National Front that's on the rise. So this discontent is going everywhere. Politics is polarised, and it's increasingly polarising. It is a bit kind of 1930s light in terms of what we've seen since the financial crash, in terms of that polarisation of politics. If there's another crash, then that polarisation will only get greater. But in terms of, you're quite right, the issue of immigration is, as I've said, people see many of the problems they face through that prism. And there are things that actually we can say. And, you know, I mean, just on that, you know, it's frustrating because the Leave campaign are trying to say now they're trying to defend the NHS. Absolute shysters. You know, these are people who, you know, that well-known lefty, the former Conservative Prime Minister John Major, said that the NHS would be like a hamster in a cage with pet pythons if these people come to power, because they support this, on record supporting this privatisation, replacing it with private insurance, charging for medical services. And the reality is with the NHS is its problems are not caused by immigrants, the opposite. The NHS would collapse overnight without immigrants. Foreign-born nurses, foreign-born doctors, and because of cuts to public services, so they cut nurse training places, we have to recruit 1 in 4 of our nurses, actively have to go abroad and recruit them, because otherwise the NHS would literally implode. But the problem is, you know, I think in terms of, you know, when people feel there's pressure on their public services, I obviously think that's caused overwhelmingly by cuts. But there are things you can do. There used to be a migrant impact fund, which was introduced by the last Labour government. And the point is, EU migrants pay in more than they get back. But that seems quite abstract to people. But if that money was ring-fenced, and it was given as a migrant impact fund with immigration dividend to the communities with the highest levels of immigration, that would help. In terms of stopping the undercutting of terms and conditions, which actually the rules, rights we have secured as being members of the EU actually do try and facilitate, but we obviously need to massively strengthen them, including banning agencies from only recruiting workers from abroad, for example. And that's that often causing that resentment and all the rest of it. And the problem is, in terms of what you're saying, is it's the very simplistic but appealing message of the right. I don't quote Ronald Reagan often, obviously, but he said when you're explaining, you're losing. And there was a lot in that. If you say, there's a lack of housing because there's too many people coming in. There's a lack of secure jobs because foreigners are taking them. Your wages are falling because foreigners are undercutting them. Public services are being under pressure because there's so many people coming in from abroad and using them. If I instead start talking about the failure of governments to allow councils to build housing, or talk about how policies of deindustrialisation and cuts have ripped away secure jobs from the economy, or because of the lack of strong trade unions, because of anti-union laws and the form of globalisation we've had, people's wages have been hit. That is a hard and complex argument to get across. But that is what we have to work on, getting across that coherent, appealing message, a message based on hope that actually resonates with people. But if you look at the polling, it's very clear that those pollsters call working class are far more likely to support leaving than those who are middle class. The younger you are, 18 to 25-year-olds are overwhelmingly in support of Remain. Older Britons who are most likely to vote are most likely to support Brexit, apart from people over the age of 75, interestingly, people who remember the war. But that is an obvious reality, that lots of working class people are going to vote leave, A, because they feel many of their problems are caused by immigration, including in areas where immigrants don't exist. Secondly, they see a Conservative Prime Minister, who they don't like, from a different world from them, campaigning with pillars of the establishment, and they want to stick two fingers up it. This is a time when people who feel they're ignored and despised and reviled, suddenly they can punch the entire establishment in the face. And this is at a time of anti-establishment sentiment sweeping the Western world. These are factors, clearly. And the truth is, as I've said, what we have to do, those of us, whatever the result, we have to now, this is a shock to the system, whatever the result, because of how close it is, we have to work on how we actually come up with a coherent alternative, spoken in a language that people understand, that explains the problems people face, and has an appealing, coherent alternative to it. It's not inevitable that discontent goes to the right. Spain has not witnessed the rise of a mass anti-immigration xenophobic party. That hasn't happened there. It's not like we're hardwired to do that in this country. And there is this proud tradition in Britain, as elsewhere, of movements that united people in order to hold the people at the top of society to account instead of blaming each other. But that's what we have to do, and it's not easy. I wish I could say, we're only a week and a half away, I wish I had this easy solution. I know what the problems are, and I think what we have to do to address them. In terms of this referendum, it's very late indeed, and the only thing we can all do now is do our best to campaign.
Too true. Something you were saying, I think kind of leads into the discussion around migration. So one of the big worries is if we do find ourselves in a Brexit situation is what is going to happen to the status, immigration status and employment status of 3 million European nationals working here. And in terms of Polish, because we're in a room full of Polish people, is it about 1 million in this country? It's the second largest migrant community in the country after the Indian community. Because already with the Immigration Bill, with the Immigration Act rather, we've seen the infrastructure created for a paid-for National Health Service. So off the back of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, we've created an infrastructure, the state has created an infrastructure for a paid-for service, which is then going to come and hit all non-migrants. So it's basically a kind of medical insurance that all non-UK nationals are paying now. So one of the fears, if we're looking at Denmark, a few months ago, a deal was signed with the blessing of trade unions to economically integrate refugees. This is mainly dealing with Syrian refugees, whereby they will be employed on inferior wages and be put on 2-year apprenticeships. It's a kind of immigrant workfare or refugee workfare. Also, employment is tied to accommodation, so some of these detention centres or social housing that refugees are staying in is actually tied to their job, so they have to behave in the job, not disrupt the job, not try and get better conditions or better wages, or they could lose their home. That's Denmark, it's not this country, but it's showing already this tendency, and all the other laws that we've seen in Europe regarding refugees, about being, Switzerland, allowing for, is it Switzerland or Austria, and Denmark actually, for jewellery to be taken away and possessions from refugees. So already we're seeing the conditions created for absolute, second and first class citizen status, which exists in an informal way already and in an official way with health service in this country. But how much deeper could that go? How much worse could that get? Maybe you don't have an answer to that, but I'm just kind of putting it into the mix, because this is real questions that are going to be asked in the next few months if we've got Brexit in this country.
Well, it can go deep. And we all know from the history of 20th century how deep it can go. But one thing that should be always remembered when we talk about migration is the flip side. You mentioned NHS and how the NHS is at the moment actually running only because of migrant workers who work there. But the flip side is the NHSs of the countries that send flags of migration to the United Kingdom are not running that well. And this is, for instance, a history that happens not only into Poland, but in many countries in Central and Eastern Europe. The nurses who work here, who moved here in order to get a decent standard of life, are exactly those nurses that are working in Polish hospitals at the moment. And the reason for that is, of course, that we have a country, that we have a European Union that has extreme income disparities. We have extreme inequality regarding the wage levels. And this will undermine all fights for solidarity, because it's very easy for the right wing to maneuver, and it's very easy for the right wing to blame the other in the circumstances where those disparities are so huge. So I think that the major question here is, beside basic campaigning at the moment and stopping them here and now, is to fight for a more equal, economically more equal Europe. And without it, we will face this problem to a larger and larger extent, because the big promise of the liberals that the market will bring all the boats up obviously did not fulfill. And the consensus around this liberal model of European integration is obviously cracking. The problem is that the only political power, that only political force that is efficient now in exploiting the fact that the liberal consensus is cracking is unfortunately far right. And that is because I think we are not audacious enough. We don't claim to go further than just to fight back or think about things that we had 5 or 10 years ago, and we don't want to lose now, or we want to regain because we still remember how they existed. We don't say aggressively enough. We want a great equalization of income. We don't say aggressive enough. We want a European social policy that really works, and it's not just a set of regulatory directive, but it's a big redistribution. And only by these means we can have a stable European society, because this is the point where we must one day reach. Simply, if we want to keep this tool of European integration on the table. So I don't have any good answer to the question how to mobilize workers here for solidarity with migrants. And I have big fears about what will happen after possible Brexit, because people who are faces of this camp and who will get immensely stronger are obviously a bunch of racists, are obviously a bunch of representatives of upper strata of British society who would be very happy to go very deep into the word we've mentioned at the beginning. So keeping fingers crossed, but in the long run we need to change the structure of Europe and work toward real equalization of income in order to be able to efficiently fight far right. That's what I think, at least.
And that does have to include immigrants and refugees from outside of Europe, because what we're seeing again is, people are being allowed to drown, and people are being warehoused into camps rather than treated with respect and given a basic income. You know, if we can't get a basic income, no one can get, you know, or if refugees can't get a basic income, who can get a basic income? Basically, we should all have it. But what we're seeing is this kind of radical escalation of inequality, which is really being intensified through just, you know, exploitation of refugees, but dehumanization of refugees. And instead of people being forced into situations where they're either locked up in camps or being put into forced labor or being put into forced work, tied to their accommodation for lower wages and properly being designated as second class, we need to get rid of class, you know? I think that has to be a demand. And at the moment, it's a question of, you know, they shouldn't be getting what we can't be getting. But the question is, and I mean, I'm saying this from a sort of reaction, playing like a kind of reactionary working class person who is saying this kind of thing, like why should the refugee get the council house, or why should the immigrant get this, that, or the other? How do we bring about a situation and a climate and a narrative which says we all need it all, you know? And I mean, a lot of people say that's just wishful thinking, but how else are we going to actually progress into a commons, a genuine commons? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You talking about social?
No, it's not democratic socialism. It's revolutionary, you know, communism. That's what I'm saying. Polish people, the C word.
Well, yeah, I won't go that far, but I would talk about building. I mean, what we want to do is we want to build this. Well, we will all differ in terms of the society we want, but it's a society run in the interests of the majority, which puts the needs and aspirations of the majority, of the real wealth creators, working people, and keep our countries ticking day after day. A country run by them and for them and in their interests, rather than a country run as a playground for a tiny elite. And that means extending democracy to every part of life, not just where you go out and vote every 5 years, but that means in the economy, that means in the workplace. And that means a society where, as I say, people's needs come before those of the market. And you can see that at the moment because we've had the destruction of jobs in this country for, you know, industries that have been ripped away by economic vandalism by successive governments. And, you know, take steel. You've got this idea, which some Brexiteers argued, that we can't intervene to save our steel industry because of the EU, which was nonsense. And the government actually then they took a 25% stake in it and all the rest. But the government, our government, the British government, has been out in Europe vetoing efforts to stop, to take measures against their friends, the Chinese dictatorship, who are flooding markets with steel dumping in order to destroy steel in this country and elsewhere. That is our government in the EU who are trying to stop action being taken there, instead of an industrial strategy which would actually allow the flourishing of the skilled jobs of the future, like Germany. Germany's part of the EU, obviously, and they've had an industrial strategy where instead of just saying, the market can decide, they've intervened and they've created hundreds of thousands of jobs in renewable energy, for example, taking on the existential crisis of climate change, but also giving people secure jobs. It's the same with the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership. Which government has been the biggest cheerleader of that treaty? It was our government, again, because the British Conservatives are perfectly happy to surrender British sovereignty as long as they're surrendering British sovereignty to multinational corporations. The whole concept of sovereignty is completely disingenuous. But obviously we have a vision of a different Britain and a different Europe, which is democratic and accountable, running the interests of the majority, not in the interests of major corporations and tax avoiders and all the rest. And we've got to be more confident in the way we do that, because part of the problem is we've been in a very defensive posture. We're defined by what we're against rather than what we're for, and our opponents often have been better at presenting an alternative which kind of at least can resonate with people's everyday needs and experiences. So that's what we have to do. We have to be able to have a coherent alternative. I am hopeful in terms of how things can change in Europe, because, you're talking about people leaving other countries in Europe and actually that having a detrimental impact on where they live. And Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos in Spain, says he doesn't want hundreds of thousands of Spaniards forced to flee their country and keep the bars of Britain and France running because they can't get a job in their own country after they've gone through university and the rest. He wants them to be able to be in their own country. The imposition of cuts and austerity all over the Eurozone, which are destroying the jobs and the security and the lives, particularly of younger Europeans have been most hit, which is then driving them out, particularly in Spain, Portugal, Greece, those countries that have been most affected, to other countries. Yes, we should defend the right of people to move. That doesn't mean saying that we want people to be driven out and of their countries, of their communities. We want to build a Europe, as you say, which is equal and just and running the interests of the majority, where if people want to move because they have a reason, they've got this job they want to take, but if it, rather than being forced to move, simply because they don't feel they have a future in their own country, they're voting with their own feet, and I think that's a really critical point. But yeah, of course we should be ambitious. It's not just what the injustices that we're opposed to, it's the alternatives to those injustices. And, I probably wouldn't argue for revolutionary communism, but I would argue for a democratic socialist society running the interests of the majority.
Okay.
That's a kind of compromise you do.
It's a compromise. I'm not sure it's a compromise that I want to live with, because it's not ambitious enough, because there's still the reduction of a person's worth to their wage labour, to their ability to sell their labour. And what happens when you can't sell your labour, or you don't have the skills to sell your labour, or your labour is priced so low that it doesn't feed you, or there isn't the work. We're never going to have full employment.
You said basic income.
That's
a very good place to start.
I think let's talk about universal basic income. Because this is a way of people being
I'm trying to
beyond.
compromise here. Basic income, lots of people, including on the right as well as the left, argue for basic income on the basis technology now people think will end up destroying more jobs than it creates. And as people's lives become more insecure, particularly amongst younger people, if you have that basic income to replace the stigma of means-tested benefits, depending on people's circumstances, that also would allow people to flourish, to have more independence in their lives. Yeah, that's not revolutionary communism. It's a big step forward to it.
Some would claim that it's campaigns liberalism, actually.
Milton Friedman supported it, and he was
so,
not revolutionary communism.
No, that's why I remember.
I haven't finished.
But the problem is that many of us who are happy to talk about basic income forget about the redistributary effect of still existing social policies. Now, the basic income, if it is to be talked about, it must be built over what we have already and not cut what we already have and what organized social movements managed to win over the last 150 years. So as something added, yes, but as something that simply replaces current social policies, it might have a bad effect on those who are at the moment still alive because of existing social policy institutions and who might not be able to do so in the reality of basic income that is just a transformation of current social policy into basic income model.
Okay, but to go a bit further, also if we're looking at interconnected energy systems, democratically controlled, shared renewable energy systems, between European countries, within our own countries, that are owned by the state, that are owned by communities. This is something that could make a radical difference to how energy is used and supplied when we're facing climate change. That could require a lot of European cooperation, but that is looking at the common means of energy ownership. It can also combat fuel poverty, which is huge in Portugal, in Greece, and Poland, not to mention in this country as well. But also, how do we have a common transportation system? How do we have these kind of commonly owned? Basically, I'm kind of talking about commons, which, yes, it could be deemed like a revolutionary communist idea, and I'm not obviously relating that to what Poland has been through. But you know, if we're talking about this shared Europe, if that's going to happen, if that can really happen, then we're going to have to see a kind of socialization of a lot of the means of social reproduction, of our means of reproduction and communication.
Well, on that, I mean, also, it would be good to hear from people here as well, because I'm sick of my own voice, quite literally. But on that, I mean, again, in Germany, you know, I'm not lauding Germany as society's the future, obviously, but it's always important to look at aspects of other countries and what works. And one of it is they have community-owned energy. So rather than you know, having big private monopolies as we have in this country, they have community-owned energy schemes at the local level. And that's because there's something called feed-in tariffs, where the state will basically give discounts to local people when they create their own renewable energy systems, and that's created lots of jobs and so on. I think that's a really interesting idea. Public ownership, take rail. In this country, we've got a ridiculous, fragmented, inefficient railway system. It can be cheaper to fly halfway across the world than travel by train in your own countries. You will, some of you know, and the trains we have are just a joke. You know, whenever I go to another country, use their trains, it's like going to the future. And you know, we have these overcrowded trains where you end up paying £200 for a ticket. You don't even have a seat. People just sitting on the floor. It's ludicrous. And what we should have is as each franchise expires, bring them under public ownership. And this time, instead of having bureaucrats running them, actually have democratic ownership by workers on the railways as well as passengers as well. So we should explore these ideas. But it'd be great. Let's see what I don't know.
Yeah.
On here
What do people? Yeah.
I just want to go back to earlier point you've made, because I will not have a chance to talk about. My name is Isabella. I love some of your ideas.
So, I don't like some of my ideas.
And I would recommend everyone in this room to go and read your books, Chaffs. It opens eyes to what happened to working class here, and demonization of working class in Poland. We see that through discussion about the 500 zloty money, which you might not be familiar with this concept, but basically mothers are given money monthly, which is equivalent to child benefit. And there are a lot of, I've seen on Facebook, a lot of people talking, oh my God, what are you going to spend their money on? And then you see that what you're talking about, how do people polarize? Where do the polarization is coming from? Who am I to tell them what to spend their money on? But this is one point. But another point is actually, today on, I think Economist had an article, I didn't have a chance to read it, that in Austria, you know what happened? It was just by the small majority Green Party won, and the research came back with the figures that 60% of men were supporting right and conservative, and 60% of women were supporting left. So I think this is something to work on. In my opinion, women in general nowadays are much more radical, open to new ideas. They have capacity to bring up the children and educate them and people around them. So I wonder how you see a role of women in discussions like what you said, because half of the public here are women, and we are ready to go and talk to people, but Labour Party, I think, failed women in a wide meaning of that word, that women's voice is not being included. That's my opinion. I cannot say about Poland because I left many years ago. So that's my thought. My thought is invest in educating women, invest in bringing women to your point of view, and I think they will do the job going forward, where maybe they haven't had that opportunity until now, maybe they were forgotten.
Okay, Isabella. Okay, so is that more like a question or a
It's a great thought. Yeah, but that's the absolute key point. Yeah, really, really key point.
Well, that's a question. There is no question. Everyone
I think we should just it'd be nice to have
Yeah.
discussing it. Yeah, that's a really important point.
That's a quick question to all three of you. There was an article in The Guardian today, a funny article about how Brits could live in a post-Brexit world, and it was about freezing your cheese and going holidaying in Albania. And it was funny until you realise that the moment the cuts and the budgets start coming in, then the activists in politics, in arts, in literary arts are going to be the first to be hit. So a question to you is, any tips for people who want to remain active, politically active, artistically active, with fewer resources, with less time, and with a lot more anger?
Okay. That's a good question. Okay.
Thanks very much for all the campaigning that all three of you are doing, and thanks for the discussion so far. I want to bring us back to what everyone needs to do in the next week to save Britain and bring Britain back from the precipice, to use Owen's words. So Labour hasn't been willing to really talk about immigration, which, as we know, is the main concern of people who are minded to vote Brexit, and presumably a major concern of people who haven't yet made up their minds. So what's the strategy? What's the wise strategy? Should we talk about immigration and challenge the lies which the Brexiteers have been peddling, and also some of the prejudices, the nationalism of some people who are really concerned about immigration when really that's not the big thing? Or should we focus on the economy and other hot topics?
Okay. The lady there. Thank you.
I have a question for Mr. Zandberg, because I really was happy when I heard about how practical you want this action to be, and I was just wondering if you can maybe brief us on how to, how do you see the practicalities of change?
Okay, so that's a comment about gender and the role of gender equality or inequality or lack of access to political power for women that was raised by Ivana. And then 3 questions around our political arguments that we want to make around when we're faced with anti-immigrant arguments for why leave. And also, what do activists do who are active in the arts and creative arts and who might be reliant on funding for that? What do they do, or what do any of us do when we see our funding cut and we have more time on our hands and more anger? And then a specific question to Adrian about arguments to make, but we can all respond. Adrian?
Okay, let me start then. I would agree that there is a potential of radicalization of women, and especially because under the pressure of cuts, under the pressure of decreasing access to public services, they are still mostly in the position of the person responsible for providing those basics for their families, and they see the consequences, the dire consequences of those policies most directly. They absorb the shock, and of course the problem is that we live in a patriarchal society where the access of women to public sphere is restricted, and no matter how we try and declare our openness and the fact that the left wants the women's voice to be heard, we're still in a society where it's structurally hard for women. So we need compensation. Now, those compensations work to an extent only, but they are a symbolic invitation for them that there is a sphere, there's a place. We try to do so in Razem, and for instance, there are very simple tools like you have to quiz in the discussion and you divide the voice during the discussion so that 50% of the voices are women, 50% of the voices are men. We also kept the strict parity on our electoral lists, and we were the only party in Poland that had exactly 50% of top candidates women. But these are only only technical tools that cannot completely annul the dire inequality that exists in our societies, that only function on a symbolic level. But what I see that is really, really optimistic about Poland, that you might or might not know, we in Poland we now face the situation where the domination of right and growing popularity of far right extended to the situation where one might say that being Cameron would be really a mainstream position. What we see are optimistic among younger people is young girls. Young girls who are way more progressive than young boys, who are way more interested in getting active politically than their older friends who are like 10 or 15 years older. So there is something changing among young girls, as they say that the world they're entering as laborers is simply, not living in a sphere to guarantee things that could be assumed guaranteed a generation ago. So here I would agree that there is this potential for organization among women. As for how to be an activist in Britain after Brexit, I'm definitely the last person who should give an answer. The same about how to practically make the Remain campaign in the last few days of the campaign. I'm really sure that I'm also the last person who should give an advice. But regarding those practical, the practical level when we talk about Europe, I'll give an example of something very practical that gave huge support in Poland for right, and that was what is mentioned here. So the introduction of 500 zloty child benefit. Now, this is not something revolutionary. This is actually a mild introduction of some mild form of social policy tool that is quite popular in many places in Europe. But it's easy to imagine what would be an impact of an introduction of such an institution for your very own household. Now, that really organized the public debate and gave a lot of pro-social voices into the hands of the authoritarian right in Poland, because it was easy to conceptualize. You don't need to be from middle class, you don't need to be after university, you don't need to follow the public debate, you don't really need to be very into politics to understand the impact. And so this is an example from the opposite camp. But this is an example from an opposite camp that took an institution that was traditionally implemented by social democratic governments decades ago. Now, this is this level of practicality that is needed on a European level. So we talk about basic income. Let's not talk about theoretic basic income. Let's talk about, for starters, about 100 euros basic income for every European citizen in the first year, introduced all over Europe in all countries. We talk about harmonization of wages. Now let's talk about very concrete proposal how to introduce European minimum wage based on purchase parity, and how in practice it would look in the pocket of laborers in different countries. So that's what I mean by that level of practical message that I'm afraid the left all over Europe has been lacking for many, many years.
Well, firstly, in terms of the role of women, I mean, firstly, it'd be good if the left was a bit more representative, not just in terms of wider society. I mean, look at Britain, full stop, in terms of underrepresentation in Parliament. The number of women is 23% of MPs. Sudan, that well-known bastion of feminism that has more MPs in its parliament, so that just puts that in perspective. But the cuts have disproportionately affected women, of course, and whether that be in terms of more likely to be public sector workers, whether that be cuts to social security, policies that, for example, disproportionately affect lone parents, 90% of whom happen to be women. then you can see those policies. And one example, well over 1 million women face domestic violence, it's estimated, every single year in this country. And because of cuts to local authorities, services for women fleeing domestic violence have been slashed back. In a country where 1 to 2 women every single week is killed by a former or a current partner. Women's Aid alone, was reported last year, the year before, were turning away 230 women and children every single day. I think all of these come together. The left is no left unless women and the liberation of women is absolute centre. And there was an attitude I think on the old left of first we sort out class and we have our some sort of revolution, and then after that we'll deal with the issue of women and everybody else. And I think that's changed to a degree. Still has a long way to go. Not least as women activists have fought for representation within trade unions. Most trade union members are women. That's not reflected by the leaderships yet, though the leader of the trade union movement, Frances O'Grady, is the first woman general secretary this easy. But these absolutely have to be absolutely central. And what I'm inspired to go back about Spain, who have been most prominent?
Women.
Women,
On
absolutely.
1 million women on the street.
1 million women on the streets, the anti-eviction movement, which was led by people like Ada Colau, who's now the mayor of Barcelona. You've got the mayor of Madrid, these new mayors of change, as they're called. Women have been at the absolute forefront of that. I think we've got a lot to learn from Spain in lots of ways in terms of what they've done with these new movements. And one of the things they've done is made sure that women are the absolute centre of these new movements, instead of the old kind of machismo of the old left, which still exists and still prevails. And there is no left, and as I said, unless at its absolute core is the liberation of women from all forms of oppression, exploitation and violence. And that's absolutely key to what you just said. In terms of what we should say in the last weeks, week and a half. It's been such a fun few weeks though. Just have a referendum of the year every year. I think one of the things that has to be emphasised, this is a Tory Brexit. Because lots of Labour voters want to punch David Cameron in the face, and their concerns about immigration are trumping everything else. People have to realise that the only option available on that ballot paper is a Tory Brexit. It's not a Brexit on the terms of the left. It's not a Brexit on the terms of now we'll have policies that won't mean cuts and all the rest of it. It will mean if you don't like this government, the next government will be like this but on steroids. It will be far worse. And you know what? Obviously we've got to make still the case, an optimistic politics based on we can build a different sort of Europe. That kind of time's running out a bit now. And it's not about the politics of fear in the sense of, I'm not saying like David, on all sides you've got economic Armageddon, World War III will break out, lots of discussion about the Nazis, can everyone just stop talking about the Nazis in Britain for a change? But anyway, but you've got lots of that. But I mean, fear is sometimes realism in the face of danger, and this is danger, and people don't realise, they just think basically this is a big protest moment. Why should they have to march into ballot boxes on the same side as a conservative, Etonian-educated Prime Minister David Cameron, who they have resented quite rightly and understandably for so many years? So we have to make the case that this is going to be even worse, and that is just realism. It's not fear-mongering, it's not scaremongering, it's just pointing out the obvious outcome of this referendum, and I think that's what we have to focus on. But you know what, I just think after the end of this referendum, because I think it has been a wake-up call, and you're absolutely right about, partly what I've been writing about and talking about in the last few weeks has kind of been self-flagellation. Why do millions of people see so many of their problems through the prism of immigration rather than the fact we have a society run for a tiny elite, rigged in favour of private corporate interests, where the market trumps the needs and aspirations of human beings? We can't just fall on old crutches and just go, it's the media's fault, as though people are sheep who are just brainwashed. It's our failure, and the failure of people like me, to come up with a coherent answer to people's everyday problems, and a clear narrative, a story of why society is like that. Now, whatever happens, that's what we have to do. That's what we have to change. I mean, someone says, what will activists have to do? Well, yeah, whatever happens, history is full of people who faced overwhelming odds, far more overwhelming than existed today. And the way we got change was not through the goodwill and generosity and charity of the powerful. It was won by people organising, often at great cost and great sacrifice from below. And often those battles were so hard, so difficult. These were people who were demonised and ignored and persecuted and imprisoned and tortured and killed. And these are the people we owe all our rights and freedoms to. And it puts it in perspective, because yeah, things are tough and they could get tougher, there's no question about that. But they overcame far greater odds than we face today. And we have to remember that tradition. Because we don't just remember them because of the sacrifices they made for us, and we do need to remember that because it's the right thing to do. Because it's a reminder that change is not won by the goodwill and generosity of those at the top, but by people organising from below and making their voice heard. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. That's what Frederick Douglass said back in the 19th century. He was right. And I think we've got to have that sense of optimism. Because, you know, history and progress is not a story of victory, success, It's not linear. It's often setback, defeat, but then victory. And those people, the giants on whose shoulders we stand, those people overcame those odds. And no matter how hard or difficult things are and look, we will overcome these injustices. And the first, well, all of you, we all have to leave today thinking this. We're not maybe we can win one day, we will win. Because unless we have that determination and conviction, then we've lost already. So whatever happens in the next few weeks, and it could be a rocky few weeks, let's just remember that tradition. Let's build on that tradition. It's a tradition in Britain and Poland and elsewhere of the people who organised from below, and we will one day overcome.
Thank you. I don't think you should flagellate yourself too much.
Yeah.
I think you do really, you know, vocalise that tradition and remind people of that tradition, and that's part of the process as well. But I also want to just mention a bit about how we build up the capacity as activists and the arguments to basically reclaim our futures and our communities within this argument, whatever happens, whether it's Brexit or Remain. You know, how are we going to build up the power to achieve the kind of social conditions, economic conditions that we want to see? And one thing I think we definitely need to do is build up trade union power and union power within the workplace. And that can be done through organisation in whichever workplace you work in, but also in terms of changing the laws in this country, in other countries that restrict trade unions. In the 50s, in this country, unions were part of economic councils. They were part of government decision-making bodies around our services, around the public sector, around energy. There was a big seat at the table for trade unions. That was then completely destroyed through the 80s onwards, through Thatcherism and neoliberalism. Whereas now, you know, in 1979, you had 55% of the country were 55% of workers in this country were members of a trade union. Now it's 26%. So our actual capacity to organise around our economic conditions and our experience of work, the thing we do 8 hours a day in this country, has been really reduced. And a lot of people are really suffering every single day from wherever they're from, all over the country, in really depressing, you know, low-paid work, in the manufacturing sector, logistics, you know, poorly paid work. Likewise, people in white-collar jobs who are actually forming the majority of trade union members, and women being the largest make up the largest number of trade union members, are also facing so much precarity and insecurity. And in these times and conditions of big insecurity, where you don't know if you're going to still have your job next month potentially, and if you try and organise one, then you definitely won't have your job next month. You know, that creates, I think, you know, so much fear, and that's what's really being banked on. So an antidote to that is to organise in your workplace. And you know, I work with a lot of women workers. Women are mostly making up cleaning jobs. In hotels, they're the room attendants. You know, in public institutions, in, you know, all over, anywhere you see a cleaner, the majority will be actually women, migrant workers. And there's no, where is their voice? You know, when we talk about increased women's participation, it does also mean that men need to give up their voice and give it to women who are not getting their voice. The little exercise I did to, you know, at the beginning of this talk, okay, you know, I really wish that some of the Romanian cleaners that I've been working with could be here to talk about what's happening to them. They don't speak English, and I don't speak Romanian. And it's a struggle. It's a real struggle when you've got workplaces where you have so many different languages spoken, and you're trying to build unity and you're trying to build solidarity, and you've got the arguments of the far right just really trying to just destroy it and say, you know what, the answer is not translate the newsletter, the union newsletter into 5 different languages, or have a meeting with 5 simultaneous translators, or even try and organise, just get them out. And that's really depressing, and I've actually come across that. It's really, really... But anyway, the good news is, let's unionise. Secondly, it's possible. And also find ways of overcoming restrictive legislation, and that does require a lot of audacity and your own action that you're going to probably have to do outside of a bureaucratic structure while still having the protection of the union. But also, if you can join your local tenants and residents association, seriously, like if you want to get to know your neighbours, if you want to go to community meetings where you meet people and they don't share your opinions at all. I'm a member of mine, I'm the only woman, I'm with some people who really want more police on the streets and stuff, and I'm a bit like, whoa. But actually, I need to hear that, and we need to listen to each other, especially because with the housing bill having just won royal assent in this country, we're going to see so much more social cleansing, which will affect women much more as well. A lot of women who are living in the cities, who are fleeing domestic violence, who are fleeing economic hardship, are going to be put into Birmingham and other parts of the country and away from their communities. That's a really serious threat. So, get active in your local community, like get active in your community garden. That is one way of building the community that's being really undermined right now by toxic right-wing arguments. Now, it's 8:15, we've still got some time, and I see some more hands in the air. Our friend in the corner had his hand up first.
Yeah. There's a couple of things to say. One is, it's been mentioned, for example, the EU migrants, like the impact that will have in the NHS if it's a Brexit, right? But it's also like, I don't know the big number of European migrants here working like a big amount of time, like years, okay? And all the taxes they pay, that is helping make roads, paying council houses to people and everything, right? All of this will go through. Probably is a lot of money that is being pumped in social services from taxes and living here. And nobody talks about that. Nobody says about this, anything. That probably is more money than...
No, that's an important point, yeah, that people are not talking about the contribution that migrant workers make in this country, and how the issue is we need more budget, we need to have fairer distribution. Lady over there, and then you in the front.
Okay, Magda Raczyńska, and you use the word solidarity, Ewa. For me it works a little bit like, a kind of a concept, Pavlov's dog's concept. It's both full and empty in a way, and I wanted to ask you about one particular example of the recent waves of strikes in London, where the lecturers at the universities went on strike, and the students at the same time, in many cases of the same universities, were on strike as well, but they were striking separately. And for me, the problem with this organising, and I'm very much for it, and I totally appreciate the effort and how difficult it is to organise, but once people get into it, there is already one barrier crossed. So what stops people here in this country, because I cannot understand it, from kind of getting together and doing some things together? Because, one huge wave of strikes, and parallel wave of strikes, and nothing came out of it. Well, maybe the impact would have been bigger if, there was some kind of cross-organising between the two different sectors, which obviously takes me back to Polish history, because we also had in the 20th century, like a wave after wave after wave after wave, until 80s happened. And suddenly everything came together. And I know it was a momentum, and it has to be a momentum. It's not always possible to get all these people together. But can you just, what's stopping people from across different sectors and different classes here? Because we're talking about, kind of different stratas, social stratas as well, from getting together to do something.
Are you talking about like a national coordinated strike or a
Not
sectoral
necessarily
strike?
national, but you know, the sector of higher education. Just this one example, right? And it's not happening even there.
I'll take a few hands. I think we can all help answer that question.
Hi, I'm Amelia. I just wanted to ask, say if we did remain in the EU, how would we address, first of all, do you think right-wing populism in Britain could then increase because the Brexiteers didn't get what they wanted? And if so, how would we address that? Because there is an increasing demand to leave the EU. Obviously, that's why we got have the referendum. And because history can show that scapegoatism often repeats, so what is it that we can do to address that? Because it's okay us like saying all these problems that will happen if we do leave the EU, but at the end of the day, addressing this like right-wing populism has to happen before it gets out of hand, regardless of the outcome of the referendum.
Yeah. Some more hands. With the glasses.
Right. Thank you for the fantastic talk. I'm a student from UCL. I'm going to study in Krakow next year. I have a particular question for Mr. Owen. Like, I think those campaigners who are campaigning to vote for leave is not like totally denying that migrants contribute in the British economy. They know that migrants are good for the economy to some extent. What they're arguing is that anything become excessive could backfire, and what they're arguing is that if in the near future the migrating numbers is coming to the threshold that which becomes out of Britain's capacity, the British authorities wouldn't be in control of its own borders to stop it. Do you think this argument is sensible, or if not, what kind of opinions would you put to refute it? And my second quick question is that I do agree that the Polish migrant workers' rights shall be more protected overseas. But on the other hand, we have seen a very radically right turn in Poland itself. Like, it appeared to me that in some part of Poland, the Polish people appear to be not like foreigners or refugees that much. They vote for Law and Justice Party or Andrzej Duda or something like that. And when I was in Lublin, somebody personally refused to give me any directions because I don't speak that fluent Polish as they desire. I was like, I mean, jestem Chińczykiem, like, mówię słowo po polsku. So, and you have said that, like, those kind of right turn is triggered by the fear of the laws for the liberalization. But from my point of view, I can hardly see any kind of laws Poland has got from integrating to Europe. So, why do you think Poland has witnessed this kind of radical right turn to elect Law and Justice Party to be in power? Thank you.
Great. I'll take 3 more hands. Oh, and now you put about 10 minutes left. So, oh my, how to do it? Okay. Okay. 5 hands. Okay. 4 hands and be very brief. Here.
Me, yeah. I'm an activist with an Our Europe is Possible, among other things, and I wanted to bring back the attention to the massive generation gap we're seeing here. Most young people obviously want to remain, most older people want to leave. When I was campaigning this morning at Waterloo, when we spoke to students, young workers, young families, their reaction was very positive. When we spoke to older people, they were extremely hostile, some even like physically violent. And the argument they used was that they care about the future of their grandchildren. And you've seen a big push on like young voter registration. Some of it has been excellent, some of it has been extremely patronizing in my opinion. But how do we communicate to the older generation now that actually they care about our future, they should vote Remain because that's what we want?
Okay, you're in the blue shirt.
Yeah, I think there's a way to leave. I agree that one of the principal reason is immigration. I think we don't actually shift the argument around immigration until we really take it on. I think there's many people on the left, and particularly in the Labour Party, who are willing to make concessions. I work for the same union as ever, and it's the case that even our union is producing posters saying, well, immigration isn't as high as it is in Norway. That doesn't actually help the argument. It's making out concedes that immigration may be a bad thing. I think we really need to be taking on the arguments around how actually immigration it is economically good for this country, and how people give more to the public purse and take away from it. So we really need to take on that prejudice, but also I think the other reason that the Leave vote might win is that we don't have a coherent voice on the left in terms of the Labour Party actually really spelling out what a different Europe could be. I think the leadership of the Labour Party, Corbyn, etc., are doing the best job that they can do in trying to articulate that vision, but it's really undermined when you look at lining up beside David Cameron to call for a vote for Remain, sharing a platform. That tells people who are sick of neoliberalism and the attacks on living standards, actually maybe there isn't an alternative. So I think in terms of what people here can do as well, is see that there is a major battle going on in the Labour Party and a fight for whether we have a real opposition in this country that can really challenge what Cameron, etc. are doing. And I encourage people to join the Labour Party and be part of that fight as well, in supporting Corbyn and supporting that alternative.
Okay. The woman over there with the glasses. Oh yeah, okay, you and the woman there. Not wearing glasses. Maybe you first and then you.
Okay. It's just a comment that I think perhaps feeds into the question you asked. I think the important thing that was missing from the debate today for me is the issue of labour segmentation, which feeds into the issues of difficulty organising, solidarity, and also the issue of how do we approach immigration. So I'm talking about a situation where an agency brings 400 Portuguese people to work in a car factory in the west of England, or the construction industry being dominated by Poles, etc. So I think you can have practical solutions where you offer 500 zloty to people, but it still is not going to bring them together. The segmentation means that it's very easy to pitch one group against another, and I think we've seen it in a certain form also in Poland. There is a reason why the economic special areas are based where they are, and we've seen that giving people 500 zloty didn't really, at least so far, do much to bring the society together and to stop people jumping at each other's throats. So I personally see the practical solutions going more in the direction of doing something against labour segmentation than more populist steps of, or perceived as populist of giving money away.
When you say labour segmentation, do you mean large groups of a particular migrant worker population speaking one language in a particular sector?
In a sector or in a factory. Like I said, we
actually, for me, it would be a dream instead of like 10 different languages. You basically, very quickly, you find people who are leaders in that community and you get them to join the union, you get unity building, you create a trade union. That's how you do it. That's how people do it on the docks.
Then if you, and this is what is happening, Portuguese workers in a car factory, then you have resentment from the local people because they feel that they cannot get through. It's,
so you're talking about supplanting the jobs, that the jobs are not going to local people.
Yes. And this being, a counter-acting force to achieve solidarity, to achieve the people coming together and supporting each other as a working class, not as certain groups. So labour segmentation.
We can come to that. 5 minutes left. Lady at the back, and then I think Owen's got to go really soon, so then we'll sum up, and we can talk afterwards as well. Yes? Yes.
I just wanted to add one more layer, which really scares me and excites me when I think about the solution. It's a fact that for me, this push for Brexit is also a very visible sign of a crisis of multilateralism, which is not only happening at the European level, but it's also happening globally. And I work on international development, so I go a lot to these EU-UN processes. And basically what I'm observing is, and I work on women's rights, basically what I'm observing is that when it comes to different instruments, whether they are human rights instruments or different agreements, it's basically that these days it's much more difficult for the group of countries to reach the agreement than it was 10 years back, and when it comes to, and obviously when we analyze it from the human rights perspective. So what I'm trying to say is that when we think about the solutions and how we respond to this and about the movement building, with all my heart, I'm for what you have been talking about, which is really local organizing and national organizing. But I think when thinking about developing the alternatives, really viable alternatives, we need to think deep, we need to think bigger, because basically the European Union is most of the countries that build European Union, and if you have the UK Tory government building European Union, it's no surprise for me that it really sucks. So basically the point is that when we organize from local, we organize to global, because otherwise we're going to miss the point.
Okay, thank you. That's it for the questions. So everyone come back, like a 3-minute sum up.
I'm going through this as quickly as I can. The point you just made...
Sorry for the heat. I don't know what happened, by the way.
Sorry.
Climate change is going to feel
the point isn't the argument you're saying that the Leave campaign are just saying, look, we're not anti-immigration per se, we just want to control immigration, that's the way to do it. Well, firstly, most immigration into Britain comes from outside the European Union anyway. The government's own figures are to have, 100,000 coming in. If you excluded all EU immigrants, it would still be 200,000. They'd be way over target, and that's because there's a need for people to come in. That's the reality. They have to fill certain spaces and all the rest. So that's actually what it brings on your point you made about that actually could increase right-wing populism, because people are being offered something which will not happen. People are not going to see a noticeable decline in immigration, because you'll end up with, I mean, what the Leave campaign is saying, in fact, just to take your logic a bit further, they're actually saying the current rules discriminate against people from outside the European Union. Now, if not being entirely disingenuous, that means having more people from outside the European Union. And obviously we're not going to have no EU people coming into Britain anymore. So in what sense is that, in any case, just on its own terms, any meaningful reduction in immigration? Yes, as I've said, if you want to talk about things like don't cut nurse training places, because then you've got to recruit 1 in 4 of your nurses from abroad, then fine. But a lot of it is things like foreign students, and polling actually on foreign students shows people are supportive of foreign students coming in. So those headline figures are often, in any case, they're often very, very misleading indeed. My argument in terms of what you say, in terms of the general point about, and it's what you were making the point up there, is it is important not to concede, in the sense that, as I've said, communities with higher levels of immigration tend to be the most pro-immigration. Not often in areas where you have a sudden demographic change. In those areas, you'll often get an anti-immigration backlash. In Hackney in the 1970s, that used to be one of the centres of the far-right National Front. Hackney now, I mean, can you imagine that now? I mean, UKIP are nowhere there. Why? Because you have a settled mixed population. People, work together, live together, sleep together. And it's true, and in areas where I grew up in Stockport, where anti-immigration sentiment is much higher than it is where I live now. Again, Stockport has very little immigration. It is to do with problems that people face. These are real, genuine problems. The lack of council housing, because it's not being built. We have the lowest level of peace building, house peace building since the 1920s. The councils can't build the housing we need. We don't have good, secure jobs because the government have stripped our economy, including by vetoing efforts within the European Union to actually stop that from happening. Where other European countries have an industrial strategy, we don't, so those industries and those communities have been left to rot. Where we don't have strong enough workers' rights, so people can be undercut, and that includes, if you're an agency worker from this country, let alone anywhere else, you could be used to undercut the terms and conditions. It's not your fault, it's the fault of the lack of workers' rights that need to be strengthened. So these are arguments we need to make. It's not easy, but I could just easily just capitulate and go, well, look, it is so entrenched, anti-immigration sentiment. It's so rampant. across every single demographic group in this country. It varies in scale. Younger people are far more pro-immigration than older people. But nonetheless, it is a consistent part of British society. The large majority of people in Britain want less immigration. It is pointless for me to sit here and pretend otherwise. And I could just go along with that and say, well, let's start talking about restricting freedom of movement, of labour and all the rest. But I can't sit here in good faith and say that the problems that people face are caused by immigration, because it's just not borne out by the facts. It just isn't. And that is a difficult case to make, increasingly difficult as things have looked. But it is still the truth. And that is just the reality. You talk about the contribution, of course. You know, my grandmother worked for the NHS since its foundation, and she cared for the NHS. Her last few months alive, it cared for her as well. And she was looked after by, you know, as Dennis Skinner, the Labour MP, put it when he went to hospital, it was like the United Nations. You know, and yet included Polish care workers, Lithuanian nurses, Italian doctors. Of course, without the contribution of EU immigrants, as things stand, the NHS and other public services would collapse. That's not a solution to strained public services, is to reduce drastically the number of people, skilled workers you've got there. So we do have to make that case. Yes, let's talk about people worry about, you were talking about at the beginning, people worry about integration, people unable to speak the language. And, well, English language services in this country have been cut back precisely because of the cuts of this government. So let's invest in English language services, not least to give the ability of immigrants who want to learn English and with all the advantages that gives in this sort of society. So we should have that rational discussion, but just finally how we, you know, young people, old people, you know, we've got to avoid there is an increasing risk of a war of generations. I worry actually the many divisions within British society and how that could explode after Brexit. And one of them is younger people could feel very resentful that their grandparents have voted to eject them from the EU against their will, sometimes doing it on the basis of what is in the best interest of people who desperately want them to do nothing, you know, the exact opposite. And that is difficult because younger people have disproportionately been affected by what's happened. And older people often still have social democracy and disproportionately, you know, in the last general election, the Conservatives only had a lead amongst people over 44. The Labour had a massive lead amongst 18 to 25-year-olds, those who voted, it was only 14%. Now, we've got to inspire and mobilise more young people, yes, but we've also got to make inroads amongst older people. People like me on the left have to start talking about those issues a lot more, and that includes pension and poverty, which is still one of the highest of any Western European country. It includes like, the lack of social care for people in the last few years. So we've got to build bridges, we've got to build a cross-generational conflict. Those who say it's young versus old are playing into the hands of those who wish to pursue policies of divide and rule, low paid against unemployed, private sector against public sector, those working, living here and immigrants, and then young versus old, when the real division is those at the top of society against everybody else. That's the division in society that matters. So we have to build that coalition of the pensioner living in insecurity and the young person who's been saddled with debt for daring to aspire to an education. These are coalitions of people we have to build. So let's not give in to the generational conflict, poison, and it is poison. Let's instead build the coalition of the majority, working people and those who retired, the people who kept this country ticking day after day against an elite of tax dodgers and bankers and poverty-paying bosses, the real culprits. And it's about time we stop letting the people at the top who are responsible for the problems in British society off the hook. That is all the policies of divide and rule do. Don't blame the person at the top, blame the person down the street instead for all the ills that we face in society. It's poison, and we haven't done enough to combat it. And in the coming months, the coming years, let's all make that oath that we will stand against the politics of divide and rule and redirect people's justified land that people at the top deserve to be taken up.
Yes!
Tough job at the moment. I think the crucial question here is what can we do to bring back this feeling of solidarity that after years and years of neoliberalism simply lacks from the everyday experience of people. Now, you mentioned the two strikes that couldn't coordinate. I have a much more sad story about union organizing in Silesia region. A really sad story about miners who about 10 years ago felt stronger. So they were only interested about their very own particular fight they had to fight. We went there and asked them to share their resources and help girls who worked in supermarkets to organize. And they said, nah, it's not our job. And the worst thing we heard from one of those guys was, well, if they get high wages, we'd have to pay more in shop. Now this is the depth of how neoliberal divisionism entered the minds of the working people. And the reason that it happened, I think, is that in many, many branches of economy, we no longer have collective agreements. We no longer have branch rules that were fought by the workers, and people know that this is what they got from the solidarity action. This is also because that in many, many countries it's much harder today than it used to be 20 or 30 years ago to reach a collective agreement. This is also the result of the fact that, especially in countries, in peripheral countries like Poland, trade unions are so weak in private sector, they are simply unable to reach any level of action that might have real influence on the life of the members, not to mention branch collective agreement. But this was a school of solidarity. This was a school of transactionalism, and this was the mechanism that produced blocks of voters voting for the policy of solidarity and for social democracy for decades. It's no longer here. It's gone. And in order to rebuild it, we have to do both things. We have to organize, obviously, but we have to also fight for legal solutions that enable that. Again, we need to do something about the situation that is typical for many millions of workers in Europe, that organizing is not something realistic in current legal landscape for them. Possibly we should think about some form of obligatory democratic representation of workers on the level of the workplace, and giving it on a European scale right to negotiate. Now, using sort of the model of Mitbestimmung in Germany, not only to enter into participation in governing, but also simply to give workers the chance to have their position negotiated by an institution that shows up in the workplace, no matter how the boss doesn't like that. Now, a question that came here about the role played by the migration and the narrative of the authoritarian right to just gain power. Now, Poland is a great example of a country where you can have a scapegoating campaign against migrants, even though you don't have migrants. So, the bad news is it's efficient to some extent, even in such a situation. And that unfortunately shows that those who benefit from dividing, those who benefit from scapegoating, have an easy job to be done. But I think the real reason why the currently governing authoritarian right got the power was not that. I mean, there are three groups of voters that supported the Law and Justice camp. One of them is traditionally conservative national Catholics, people who are simply a very stronghold for years and years. But there is another group, and this is a group that was gradually getting fed up with the liberal establishment that ruled for last years, 10 years or 15 years in Poland in different forms. And what they really wanted to show was a middle finger. And voting for Law and Justice, for many of them, was this kind of anti-establishment sentiment that in different countries work differently. It can work very good, like it worked in Spain, or to some extent, like it worked in other countries of the southern fringe in Europe. But it can go very bad, and that's the case of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. The reason why it happened be so why we're now facing the situation when this anti-establishment feeling was colonized by authoritarian right, is that there was no left-wing offer on the table. Now, actually, what we had for years and years and years was a big liberal camp. Instead of having even a mild form of left, we had a post-communist formation that actually was hardcore neoliberal and quite conservative. Not to mention the fact that many of its leaders have embarrassingly nationalist attitude towards the issue of migration. Now, 2 days before I came on Facebook, his belief that actually Poland should close the borders because the migrants would bring parasites. Now, that's the level of social democratic politics as idea of, just to give you an idea of what they are. Now, so for years and years there were no other offer on the table, and the only language and the only symbolics that those who were dispossessed, those who were suffering because of the consequences of transition for their deindustrializing communities, the only language of protest and the only symbol of protest they had were those provided by right. And what we have at the moment is an effect. Now, attempts to build a left-wing alternative that is political, that is not restricted to intellectual circles, activists in campuses, but really tries to get to those communities, really tries to build an alternative that is viable also for the workers or former workers of the industrialized communities are relatively new. So we're setting first steps as Razem, and one might say that we were a bit too late. So I think that's that second group, those who are simply fed up with establishment and were looking for any red card they could show to those who push them into suffering. And the third group are those who really bought the promise that right-wing authoritarians sold about mild social turn. Now, because there are two kinds of far-right and right-wing authoritarianism now in Europe. There are guys who are just openly pretending they're standing for the small guy, like Farage, but in fact their policies are hardcore neoliberal. But, and this is the truth that left must face, there are also right-wing authoritarian movements that are eager to give some social concessions. That's the case of the National Front in France. That's the case of conservative authoritarians in Poland. Now, these are conservative authoritarians that introduced child benefit. Now, and there were many people in Poland who wanted desperately some form of social turn. And this is the only offer on the table again, the only offer considered viable. Now, we as Razem were obviously not considered viable by, due to the fact that until the last week before election, actually media did not bother to cover our campaign. And only after the TV debate, they actually had no choice than to start to inform about this. So, this is a mixture of those three groups that gave them power. But I think this might be a bit universal experience, in particular in countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Now, in order to block them, we need to split these blocks. We need to be able both to address those who are fed up with establishment and to convince those who want social change that the social change can be introduced by political movements who want, at the same time, in a package, restrict the rights of women, restrict the rights of minorities, scapegoat, imagine migrants, etc., etc. But this will take time, and unfortunately, in many Central and Eastern European countries, we are even more late than you are here with the Remain campaign. So, to cut the long story short, I think while the word solidarity might sound empty, it also has a very it also has a great organizing power when people start to believe it. And the clue is hope. The best thing that liberals managed to do over the last 2 decades was to eradicate the hope for change, was to eradicate the hope that collective action might bring real results, was to eradicate the idea that you might better rise your life by cooperating with others and selling the idea that only your individual effort is the only way to help yourself out of the trouble. Now, we need to desperately to bring that hope back, but in order to do so, it must be formulated in the proposals that are very down to earth, that are very practical, and that are that are available also to those who did not finish their university course, that are communicated in a language that is not exclusive. Now, because the temptation is, that's exactly one question of Poland, the case of Poland, to group yourself in defense of democracy, of elementary standards, with those with whom many of activists, unfortunately, share class background, share language, and share the feeling of community. That is being the liberal establishment. That is this what Corbyn had to resist, attempting to push onto a common platform with Camerons of this world. That's what we're facing in Poland at the moment. We're opposing authoritarian right, but we are not letting ourselves get pushed onto a common platform with former establishment and with liberals who are hated by very diverse communities that we must reach in order to be really able to save democracy. So, tough years ahead.
Okay, so 30 seconds sum up from me, because I know we're all melting. So there's a lot we can do. Every single person in this room can talk to somebody else and convince them about Remain, have the argument, have the conflict. Our friend here, you know, faced people who were even willing to physically attack her, but she's doing it. We've all got a duty to do that. Secondly, if you're a worker, wherever you are, you can join a union, take a lead in it, you know, vote against these ideas of the sectionalism. Our friend over here, you can't get rid of the Portuguese or the Polish or anyone, you know.
That was not my intention.
I know it's not, but some of the Brexit arguments are that's what's going to happen if we leave here. Like, they think that might be an outcome, and that's a positive outcome. So we've just got to organise together and try and actually have more control over the labour process, and, you know, as has been mentioned, get some control in industry, as unions, as workers, have our voices there, and ultimately claim it collectively, democratically. And the last thing is, don't forget to vote. And neighbours, workplace, community, it's yours. We all live in it, we all work in it, we've got a role, we have our voices. Thank you very much to Adrian and to Owen and to
you.
Razem.